Hello, and welcome to the world of game theory. Let's get started with a game. At the beginning of this game, I give you $100 and a button, like this. I can't do this for real, unfortunately, but please take the situation seriously. Imagine that 100 viewers in 100 rooms across the country are watching this video, and that each has been given $100, just like you, and a button, just like you. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to decide whether to push your button or not. That's the only decision that you'll have to make, and in doing so, you'll be deciding upon a strategy. In every game, every player has a strategy. If you're a rational player, you're going to try to adopt a strategy which will maximize your expected payoff, given what you know, or think you know, about the other players in the game. But you don't know enough yet to know whether to push. What's it do? Well, pushing this button has two effects. One that affects you, and one that affects everybody else. Actually, if nobody's actions affected anyone else, it wouldn't be a game. Games are interactive. So when you push your button, the first thing it does is to take $2 away from every other player. You push your button, and just like that, everyone else is down to $98. You still have your 100. Sounds rather vicious on your part. But other people may press their buttons too, you know. And every time they do, you lose $2, along with everybody else. If 60 other people push their buttons, you're going to lose 2 times 60, or $120. Given that I only gave you $100 to start with, you're going to end up $20 in debt. You'll have to pay up. Except that there's a way out of this for you. I said that pressing your button has two effects, and the second one targets you. If other people press their buttons and cause you damage, pushing your button will cut that damage in half. A moment ago, I said that if 60 people push, you lose $120. But if 60 other people push, and you do too, then you only lose $60. You're still $40 to the good. You've done $2 damage to everybody else, but you've saved yourself $60. So, you going to push? You've probably made some assumptions about this game, reasonable ones as it turns out. You've assumed that everybody else's button works the same way that yours does. It does, because this game is symmetric. Everyone's in the same boat. Also, since you're watching this on a DVD, you've probably assumed that everybody else has the same information that you do. That is, that the structure of the game is common knowledge to everyone. Actually, being common knowledge means quite a bit more than that. It's not just that everybody knows the rules of the game. It's that everybody knows the rules of the game. And everybody knows that everybody knows that everybody knows the rules of the game, and you get the idea. And you're right. Everyone knows the same information that you do. I want you to think carefully now and decide what you're going to do. Push or not push. I'm going to give you about 1 more minute. You're probably entertaining several different lines of thought right about now. One line of reasoning is this. We all know how the game works. It's obvious. If nobody pushes the button, everybody gets $100. I might not even be concerned about being a nice person, but I don't have to be. We can all get 100. I'd be crazy to push. It's a good argument. But a second line of argument, maybe even more compelling, is this. 100 people I don't know. Some of them are going to push. No matter what the other people do, I'm at least as well off pushing as not pushing. If I don't push, I could end up $100 in debt. If I push, at least I end up breaking even. Heck, I'm a good person. And if I'm thinking about pushing, I can imagine what the other people... I have to push in self-defense. Here's the third line. I'm not going to push. I'm not pushing because it's the right thing to do in a moral sense. I could lose up to $100. I could go $100 in debt, yeah. But it's worth it for the sake of my ethics. Or you may have decided, $100, it's not that much money. It'd be too much fun to just stir things up and see what happens. Push the button. Or you may have a competitive streak, and you know that if you don't push, everybody who does will end up ahead of you. Maybe you don't have much of a taste for being a chump. Of these 5 lines of reasoning, it's interesting to know which, if any, actually are rational. And that's a question that we'll be revisiting over and over as this course goes on. Okay, it's time to decide. I really wish that I could tally the votes that are coming in real time, but of course I can't. What I can and will do is tell you after you make your choice, the results of similar games that I've played with other people. So make your choice, and please, state it out loud. Keep yourself honest. Push or don't push? 3, 2, 1, done. Okay. With groups of strangers who have no training in game theory, generally somewhere between 30 and 70% of the people push the button. That's a pretty wide range. But if you take the average, you get 50%. So if you didn't push, that means that you're now broke. If you pushed, you still have $50. This might not make that much of an impact on you. After all, this was just a game. No, that's the wrong way to say that. What I mean to say is, of course, this was just pretend. But the game is real. It's not pretend. We're not talking about child's play here. We defined a set of possible moves by which players interacted with each other. They had common knowledge of the structure of the game, and they made rational decisions about strategies, which led to their best expected payoff. These components, players, strategies, payoffs, and common knowledge, are what make a game in the game theoretic sense. And if you change the context of this game by replacing the players with countries, and by pushing the button to being willing to engage in military conflict, then we have something which is much more than just a diversion. Later in this course, we'll find out how game theory says this game should be played. But at the moment, what we know is how it is played. And the variety of responses that we've seen in this game, between 30 and 70% pushing, show that one of 2 things must be the case. Either the theory of game theory isn't sufficiently common knowledge that people are comfortable choosing rightly, or maybe this game is an inherently dangerous one. Maybe we need to find a way to keep pushing the button from being so tempting an option. Because if 30 to 70% of the people in the nuclear version of this game decide to press the button, we're all in for a very, very bad time. In any case, the name game theory may be an unfortunate one. A more descriptive name would be strategic interactive decision making. Game theory sounds like child's play, and it's not. One of the landmark books in game theory was written in 1960 by Thomas Schelling, The Strategy of Conflict. Schelling later won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in game theory. In The Strategy of Conflict, Schelling was looking at issues such as nuclear disarmament, nuclear deterrence, resolution of international conflict, and a lot of issues that are as relevant today as they were in the 1960s during the Cold War. How do you make a threat, for example? And if you do make one, how do you make it credible? When most of us think of games, we think of card games or board games or sports. Game theory can be, and is, applied to such areas. In fact, it really got its start when John von Neumann started thinking about the optimal way to play poker. Von Neumann was one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century and the father of modern game theory. And he wasn't actually that interested in poker per se. It was that it contained inside it, in a simplified, idealized way, a microcosm of human interaction. Groups of individuals, each with their own goals, power, information, beliefs, responding to the decisions of others. Von Neumann wondered if it was possible to model something as quintessentially human as bluffing in a mathematical way. In 1928, von Neumann published his first paper on game theory, the first important work in modern game theory, which included the minimax theorem. We'll be discussing that in a later lecture. But in the less than the century that has followed the minimax theorem, game theory has made remarkable advances. In some ways, it's come full circle. A number of the winners in recent World Poker Championships have combined von Neumann's game theory with the number crunching power of modern computers to develop their winning strategies. Impressive. But board games, card games, and sports aren't at the heart of game theory. Again, game theory is the study of strategic interaction among rational players. And any time that people are interacting with one another, responding to the choices of others, or what they think those choices will be, they're playing a game. And that's what game theory is really about. What's the best way to play the game that we're in? How can we recognize a game that isn't so good for us? And when that's the case, how can we change it so that perhaps we'll do better? Reinhard Selten, one of the winners of the 1994 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in game theory, says that most people don't ask these questions. Even when making professional decisions, they engage in what's called ex post rationality. They're more likely to look backward to see how earlier situations could have been done better than they are to look forward and examine the current situation in its own right. Here's an example of failing to look ahead. Max Bazerman of the Harvard Business School was speaking to a conference of about 75 Wall Street bigwigs. Bazerman auctioned off a $100 bill. The auction had one odd twist. Whoever won the auction paid their bid and got the $100. No surprises there. But the person who bid second highest also had to pay his or her bid, but got nothing. Okay? So, the auction was held. Want to guess how much the $100 bill went for? $465. $465 for a $100 bill. How? Well, bidding got to $95, then $100. If it had stopped there, the $95 bidder would have been out $95 with nothing to show for it, second place. But if they bid $105 and won, well, then they'd only be out $5. So they bid $105. But now the person who had bid $100 was out $100. So they bid $110. And so on, and so on, and so on. Someone finally got the message at $465. Now, the structure of this auction was unusual. But again, these bidders weren't yokels. They were titans of Wall Street, controllers of multi-million-dollar portfolios. Bazerman says that he's run this game at least 600 times and has never seen the bidding stop at less than $100. And if you think that the structure of this auction is just silly, I'll point out that a war of attrition has just this structure. Costs keep on mounting up and mounting up and mounting up until someone gives up. Everybody pays for the protracted war. Later in the course, we'll look more closely at wars of attrition. We'll also look into auctions and see how their design can have a dramatic and sometimes surprising impact on the money raised. The $100 auction brings up a point I want to make at the beginning of this course. A lot of the games that we'll study are pretty simple in structure, more simple than the things that you face every day. This simplicity of the examples is one of the common criticisms that are made of game theory. Reinhard Selten, the Nobel Prize winner of whom I spoke earlier, addresses this point nicely. He says that, yes, our examples are simple, and it's precisely that simplicity that makes them useful in developing an intuition about how to solve real-world problems. Think for a minute about how effective decision makers generate decisions. They blend previous real-world experience with clear examples of general principles. Our games act as parables, in part because they are relatively simple. They're analogies for the more complicated games that we face in normal life. So we often choose our examples to be as clear as possible, like the $100 bill example, rather than trying to rip them from the headlines, like a war of attrition. Game theory, properly applied, can be applied to eminently practical real-world problems. As an example, we'll be studying co-opetition It's a game theoretic model of analyzing business interactions, developed by two business school faculty, one from Harvard and one from Yale. Co-opetition is thoroughly grounded in game theory and directly applicable to real-life decision-making. But game theory isn't a panacea. There are places where the predictions of game theory and observed behavior diverge dramatically. In this course, we'll be looking at the failures of game theory as well as the successes. And even the failures can have practical value. Ever traveled to a foreign country? Then you know that one of the benefits of such travel is when you come home. You see your own society, its norms, its values, in a new light. In the same way, when game theory predictions differ from the decisions that we make in everyday life, it can lead us to look more closely at the decisions that we do make and better understand why we make them. Essentially, game theory provides a baseline for comparison. People have been trying to make strategic decisions for a long time. In war, in politics, in business, in love. So it's not surprising that game theory has been around for a long time. Even Greek mythology includes quite a few game theory stories, as we'll see later in the course. But modern game theory is less than a century old. Von Neumann's mathematical work didn't catch the attention of the larger world until 1944. In that year, he teamed up with economist Oscar Morgenstern to write The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, certainly the most famous game theory book of all time. They wanted to introduce people to this new field of study and to show how it could be used in neoclassical economics. Well, actually, they were a lot more ambitious than that. What von Neumann wanted to do was to provide a foundation that would allow the study of economics to be conducted as a science, like physics. It was an ambitious goal, and the theory of games made a good start at it. Earlier economic analysis usually dealt with markets. Markets are essentially unaffected by the actions of any one individual. You make your choices in response to the market, but your choice, your individual choice, doesn't affect the market very much. With game theory, you can analyze situations where individual choices do matter. The result has been a lot of good economics and a long string of Nobel Prizes in economics for people who've done work in game theory. Like what? And what's it good for? Well, a number of prizes have been awarded for work involving auctions. So let me give you another real-life example, a little bit more complicated than the $100 one. Federal governments generally regulate their radio spectrums. They sell the rights to various parts of that spectrum to those who are interested in licensing them. This is generally done in one of four ways: administrative process, lottery, first come, first serve, or auction. Usually, in most parts of the world, it's been done by administrative process, and that's how it was in the US, which meant long hearings with the FCC. But then in the 1980s, the number of firms wanting licenses skyrocketed. In 1982, the FCC adopted a lottery system. The licenses were given away to whoever won the lottery. It was thought that afterwards, the telecom companies would sort it out for themselves by trading licenses back and forth. Not a great plan. Lotteries are inherently inefficient. Obviously, the people who win a lottery aren't necessarily those who will most value the resource or be best able to use it. And the reshuffling of licenses that came about actually delayed the entry of the US in the wireless telecom market when compared to Europe. Also, the FCC put no restrictions on who could enter the lottery. Sometimes this had embarrassing consequences. One year, the cellular license for Cape Cod went to a group of dentists. The dentists, no fools, promptly sold it to Southwestern Bell for $41 million. In 1993, the lottery approach was deemed to be a failure by Congress. It mandated that the FCC try some kind of auction. It was concerned about issues of inefficiency, of course, but it also wanted to get a slice of all that money that was being passed around by license exchanges. But it turns out there are actually a lot of different ways to run an auction. We'll look at a number of them in a later lecture. And what the government did was to try to address multiple objectives. Yes, they wanted to raise money, but they wanted to make sure that the spectrum was distributed efficiently. And they wanted to channel business to minority-owned businesses and avoid monopolies, and so on and so on. So the FCC hired a bunch of economic game theorists to design the the auction. Their job was to analyze the problem and come up with a structure. The details don't matter here, but one aspect is important and I want to focus on it. They designed the auction so that all of the frequencies would be auctioned off simultaneously in a number of rounds. Different markets were up for bid at the same time. You see, bidding on frequencies one at a time is kind of like bidding on shoes one at a time. If you're not sure you're going to get the left one, you're not going to pay as much for the right one. In the same way, a company might be put a lot more value on the cellular licenses for, let's say, Washington, if they know that they can get the ones for Baltimore at the same time. So, with the help of game theory, the government created a game that was much better than the old one. Certainly, it was much better for the government. They raised over $400 billion for the U.S. Treasury in the first 5 years. But it was demonstrably better for the other stakeholders as well. The structure of the auctions meant that the licenses went to those who valued them most, as opposed to, say, dentists. That's game theory. Strategic, interactive decision-making. You know, when I told my mother I was teaching this class, she thought it was going to be 24 lectures on Parker Brothers monopoly, or risk. The monopolies and risks that we'll be talking about are of a much more serious nature. Game theory sounds like fun. And it is fun to study, but many of its applications are far from trivial. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a game. In fact, it was Thomas Schelling of the Strategy of Conflict fame, remember? Schelling was the one who coined the term brinksmanship. The lead up to the war in Iraq was full of games. A lot of them were games of incomplete information. Hans Blix was looking for weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam Hussein, if he had had them, would have been trying to hide them. This is a classic pursuit-evasion game, and in a later lecture we'll see how such games play out. As it was, Hussein didn't have WMDs, and he said as much. His problem was the one that you often have when you try to credibly signal the truth of your claim. We'll see that signaling and signal jamming, its opposite, are also important parts of game theory. And the biggest problem that Hussein faced was the one that people usually face. How do you make yourself believed? Game theory applications don't have to be geopolitical. Think of threats, promises, and commitments. Yes, they can be useful in brokering a treaty, but they can also be useful in passing a piece of legislation, or getting your supplier to come down on a price for a supply, or getting your kid to do his homework. Threats, promises, and commitments have their own lecture in this series. They can give you enormous leverage, but using them is more subtle than a lot of people think. Ever seen a mother in a grocery store yelling to a kid, "You come here right now or I'm leaving without you"? That's a very serious threat. It's also, in general, completely and sensibly ignored by the kid. Schelling will teach us how to make threats, promises, and commitments, and how to make them credible to others. As we go through the course, I'm going to invite you to go beyond the particular example that we're discussing. The power of science and mathematics is in generalizing, in seeing how apparently different problems share a common underlying structure. If you keep your eyes and mind open, you're going to find a lot of other places that our ideas apply. For example, remember our button game? If you think about it for a bit, you can see it's a lot like the problem of global warming. And so is the problem of overfishing of international waters and traffic congestion. All of these fall under a game structure called the tragedy of the commons. We'll look at how all these things fit together in a later lecture. And when we do analyze those things, we'll gain some other surprising insights, like why we use such an inefficient layout on our keyboards, or why we don't use the metric system, or why Windows is the operating system for personal computers. And after we figure these things out, there'll be 100 other problems that will yield to the same kind of tools, like why taking illegal steroids is so common among professional athletes. We'll look at voting. We all know from recent history that deciding who wins isn't always simple. The popular vote versus the electoral vote is only the tip of the iceberg, though. The playwright Tom Stoppard said, "It's not the voting that's democracy, it's the counting. we're going to see that it isn't even simply the counting. There are a lot more ways to set up a voting system than most people think. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses. We'll see that the choice of which system we use, or even simply the order in which votes are taken, can sometimes effectively decide the results of the election before the ballots are even cast. Can we fix this? Well, we'll create a wish list of properties that an ideal voting system would have, then determine if such a system is even theoretically possible. And why do candidates who make it through the primary process often show so little difference in the general election? Well, we'll have an answer. In the world of business, we'll look at pricing decisions, at market entry decisions, at how to analyze your business from a game theoretic perspective that will allow you both to increase the size of the pie and increase the fraction of it that you get to keep. We'll be crossing game theory with biology and look at the recently developing field of evolutionary game theory. It has applications in everything from bacterial drug resistance to the evolution of cooperative behavior. We'll look at why the peacock has such a long tail, and why some gazelles jump straight up when being pursued by a cheetah. We'll see why an engagement ring makes sense, how world-class soccer players and NASCAR drivers use game theory, whether they know it or not. We'll look at why you can never seem to buy a good used car, why pitchers in the National League throw fewer beanballs than those in the American League, why car insurance costs more in Philadelphia than it does in Pittsburgh, and why having more people witness a crime can actually reduce the chance that anybody alerts the police. We'll figure out why it often costs more to get your car repaired when you're a tourist than when you're a local. We'll even look at terrorism and see what our game theory what our game theory has to say about our approaches. Game theory has applications great and small. Someone even wrote a game theoretic analysis on whether to leave the toilet seat up or down in a married couple's home. I won't bother telling you the results of that study because I think we can agree it won't make a bit of difference. So, let's get started with game theory. I've defined it as the study of strategic interaction among rational decision makers. This phrase sounds more or less self-explanatory, but there are some subtle issues that I want to address here. There are three major components of any game: players, strategies, and payoffs. The players are just the people playing the game. It's easy enough. Each player has available a possible set of strategies, what they'll do, how they'll respond. And when those strategies interact, each player ends up with a payoff, which specifies how much they like the result. If I told you I had a good strategy to follow, you'd probably assume that I meant that I had a good general plan. At most, you might think that I have a set of rules that I use when making my decisions. But what I mean by a strategy in game theory is quite a bit more than this. In game theory, a strategy has to specify what decision you would make in every possible situation in which you could find yourself. Suppose I buy a vase wholesale sale for $8, and I'm deciding whether to sell it for $10 or $20. You're a potential customer, and you're deciding whether to buy it. Well, my strategies are easy to describe. I only have two: sell it for 10 or sell it for 20. Your strategies are actually more complicated. That's because you can find yourself in two different situations, depending on the price that I set. One strategy for you has to specify how you'll respond to either of those possibilities. One strategy for you, for example, would be, I'll buy for $10, but not for $20. You actually have four different strategies: buy for 10 or for 20, buy for 10 but not for 20, buy for 20 but not for 10, or don't buy for either. And the idea of buying for 20 or not for 10 might sound silly, but it might not be. You're more likely to buy a reputed diamond for $200 than you are for 20. I'm going to look at the idea of strategy in more detail in my next lecture, but today I'm just sketching things in broad strokes. With that in mind, let me take a minute to talk about the third component of our game: payoffs. Each player has chosen a strategy. These strategies interact, and the game plays out to its conclusion. You might like the outcome of the game, you might not. The degree to which a player is satisfied with the outcome is reflected in their payoffs. Payoffs are numerical values, and we generally follow the convention that the more you like the outcome, the bigger the number. In our retail game, I bought the vase for 8. If I sell it to you for 10, but you think it's worth 18, I've made $2 on the deal. You've made 8. Those would be our payoffs, if money is what we care about. Things aren't always that simple, though. In my next lecture, I'll take a more careful look at payoffs and strategies. I'll also lock down 2 other key ideas about game theory: rationality and common knowledge. As we'll see, rationality isn't what most people think it is. We'll also see a game where game theory does a horrible job of predicting human behavior. A careful look at this failure will highlight an important point. Your payoff from a game may be far, far different from the money that it pays you. So come and join me. Game theory isn't child's play, but it's going to be fun.